I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.
It's remarkable how few people have a clear picture of how critical electricity is in the lives all across the country, but nowhere more so in the city. If you don't know, we pour as much raw energy into generating electricity in this country as we do into well more than we pour into our cars, considerably more. It's as large as the entire oil sector in terms of the raw energy that goes into it, and it is far more critical to the functioning of daily life. The oil system shut down, the pipelines, the pumps, and so on. When the electricity goes, your home heating system shut down. It is really absolutely crucial, and nowhere more so in the city. The other remarkable thing about electricity is how invisible it is to most people. This wasn't always so, but if you track the history of electricity over a century, from the days when Edison started right here in Wall Street putting up the first grid, there was a time, if you look at the old pictures of the city, there was this canopy, a forest of wires across the overhead wires, of course, over the streets, the power plants visible and noisy right in this city, and you've just, over a century, you've just watched the infrastructure of electricity recede to the point where it is, for most people, a Cheshire cat. You just don't see anything but the smile. There's this happy little outlet you plug in, things light up, and you just don't worry about it. And of course, for policymakers, it has then become the same thing. You just take it for granted. It's going to happen. It will be there. And there's this vast infrastructure underneath making it all tick. It's certainly the largest physical infrastructure on the planet, our national grid and all its bits, with the possible exception of the highway system. It is enormously important, and it requires fantastic amounts of very skilled engineering and constant work, and it is very low on the policy radar screen, and this creates problems. People just aren't paying sufficient attention to the nitty-gritty of how you govern and regulate this in ways that allow it to grow. There's a very interesting political consensus now emerging between the people who want to get over carbon and the people who want to get oil. Electricity will certainly be at the center of that. We see a convergence of electricity and the transportation sector, the two very large sectors of our energy economy. It's extremely important. If I guess this was embargoed. I was going to say, if you haven't read this yet, you really should. This is really a first-class paper, and it's extremely important in a very practical way. It is beautifully written. It's full of very pretty pictures. I commend it to you very strongly. I will say no more, but let me just say a few words about its author. Hope Cohen is a deputy director of the Manhattan Institute's First Center for Rethinking Development. She focuses on a variety of development issues in the city. Before that, she was in the public sector. She worked with the MTA. She is a volunteer in the public sector as well. She's a member of Community Board 7 on the Upper West Side. As with all our panelists, she has a fuller bio in your package. I now give you Hope Cohen.
Thank you, Peter. Let's see if I can switch programs here for a moment. Yeah, I'm going to start with a brief video clip to introduce our topic today.
Gentlemen, enjoy your new power substation.
This is terrible. I thought I was going to live next to a powerful man. Now I just live next to power.
It's not all bad. At least we'll get fresh electricity.
I know it's ugly, but living next door to a power station means our baby will probably grow up to have superpowers.
And that will come in handy. Lucky's always getting pinned under cars.
Ah, there she is, my substation. God, I love saying my substation.
That thing is a goddamn eyesore. I mean, I don't want Ted's monstrosity back, but this is a residential neighborhood after all.
Well, I do know of a legal precedent involving a public utility and a dairy farm. I'll tell you on one condition. Nobody messes with my plaque.
I swear, if it wasn't for the possibility of being electrocuted, I'd buy this house.
Well, I'll take a fake house over a big, ugly one any day.
So you really only get electrocuted if you're in the house. The idea is that it's not dangerous if you're outside the house. So this is the kind of substation the guys in King of the Hill were confronted with. Electrical equipment naked to the elements and to the eye. It's actually one parcel of several in the northern Manhattan neighborhood of Sherman Creek, which I'll speak about more through this presentation. Or you might be confronted with this type of substation. This is more enclosed. You can still see some stuff peeking out the top there. But this is in such a hot neighborhood of Manhattan, a bit further south, that it doesn't matter. You can see the new condos right across the street, and there's actually one over here and one over there as well. So in a substation, I'm just going to briefly mention what's in there, because Ron's going to give you all the technical details of what they are and what they do and why we really need them everywhere. But basically, there are two major types of equipment in a substation. There's transformers, like this one, which is in Anaheim's Park substation. There's a bunch of sophisticated switches and circuit breakers, like these under London's Leicester Square. And then there's some other stuff. There's always a lot of cooling equipment, like you see on the upper left, also Leicester Square. There's tons of cabling between the equipment and then out from the substation to the larger neighborhood, and there's relays, there's control equipment, so you got a little sample. I just wanted you to get a sense of what you don't see in a substation, what you don't need to see, because it's not that attractive. So this is Edinburgh. This unenclosed substation in Edinburgh has been there quite a while. When it was first built, there wasn't much else there, and then this important major new financial district has sprouted up all around it. This is Dewar Place in Edinburgh. On the right, this is the new Caledonian Exchange. On the left, which is just across the street from the substation, that's the Exchange Place development at Dewar Place, and it includes a major Sheraton, an international conference center, and lots of commercial and retail. So you can imagine that as this stuff sprouted around the substation, it became more of an issue than it had been when it was kind of a rundown neighborhood. About 10 years ago, the substation got some notice when Scottish Power hired a lighting designer to illuminate it with various colored lights at night, making it into a piece of public art. By the time I went there this summer, they still was some illumination, nothing I could get a good pick of. They had actually dismantled some of that because this substation is being upgraded and replaced. Here's the other end of the block. The substation you just saw is essentially behind the far scaffolding there. This part of the block, this 1898 building, was a generating station. It is a landmark in Edinburgh, and in fact, all of Edinburgh is on the all of central Edinburgh is a World Heritage Site. So when Scottish Power needed to build a substation, they had tons of layers of regulation they had to deal with. And I should also mention that a space constraint because of active rail, pretty much shallowly underneath. All of this together, they decided what they would do with the new business district and so forth sprouting around it was to build the replacement substation behind this wall, hide it behind the landmark, and in order to do that, they are using gas-insulated transformers. This is a technology popular in Japan, but it is the first use in Europe of GIT. We don't have it in the US. And that equipment is more expensive generally than what we use, but also more compact. There are some environmental concerns about it as well, but that is what's making this possible. So hiding substations behind a more attractive facade is a way to go. Con Ed has been doing it on and off for years and is doing it I think as a policy matter, pretty consistently now. This is the prefab townhouse facade of Con Ed's new complex in Mott Haven, of which they are justly proud. The Mott Haven complex includes both a transmission level substation and an area level substation, and Ron will explain more about what that means. And this is a rendering of a facade intended for Con Ed's new substation currently under construction in Sherman Creek, Academy Substation. You will remember Sherman Creek from the first slide. This site is a few blocks south of that particular site. Sherman Creek is a peninsula. This is the southern tip of the peninsula, and Con Ed actually owns a great deal of land throughout basically the southern third of the peninsula. The water actually, there's water on this side as well. So this is a nice landscaping and a nautical kind of theme for the waterfront site, which will be visible from the marinas to the south. But here's what it looks like overall. This is not even all of the Con Ed holdings at Sherman Creek. The site that I just showed you that's under construction for Academy Substation is actually off to your left. But this is a good, kind of a good sense of it as seen from across the Harlem River in the Bronx. And what you see here is what the New York City zoning resolution encourages. Substations may be built without any special approval, what's known as of right, on industrially zoned land in New York, M zoning, as it's known in the zoning code. And if they are built anywhere else, unless they are very small, if they're very small, on a site less than 10,000 square feet, they can be built in certain commercial districts. But other than that, they do need to go through a special permitting process to be built, which takes time and money and is risky. Sometimes you can go through the process and end up not with the permit. So Con Ed looks for M land to buy, which may actually not be the most optimal from their engineering point of view, but if it's good enough and they don't have to go through the process, that's kind of what they go for. And then they hold on to it because it's just too difficult and expensive and risky to go through that permitting process. And this situation, obviously, it wastes land. So this is what they've been doing in London for a long time. This is Kingsway Substation in the West End of London. It dates back to 1967, in fact, and the substation is in the base of this round building. There's actually also a distribution room in the base of the office building next door, and there's actually yet another distribution room next to Peabody Terrace, a residential development that's just across a street that's about as narrow as this street here, over here. The Green Banner is actually for an adult education facility. And this is the Finsbury Market substation in London near Liverpool Station. Here's another chance for you to see his transformer. Those are transformers there. This is a very old substation dating back to the 40s. You can see all the modern commercial stuff that is sprouted around this as well. And EDF Energy, the utility in London, actually has already sold off a piece of this property for private development, and it anticipates that it will soon be selling off the rest. This substation needs to, like the Edinburgh one is, the equipment is obsolete and needs to be replaced with new equipment. So the idea will be when they need to rebuild the new substation anyway, they would build it underground with offices, with an office development above. And here's new construction, also in London. This is in the burgeoning South Bank area of London. There's actually a new substation built into this parking garage. It's just a few years old. I think it's 2002. And the yellow building is actually the back of the Hilton Tower Bridge Hotel. Or Tokyo, where they really stack stuff underground. This is actually a building that belongs to the Tokyo utility, TEPCO. A transmission level substation is under this building on several levels to accommodate all the equipment. Just off to the right is a public plaza that's used for concerts, and there's room under that. They've built out the shell for an area level substation there. This is also Tokyo. This is near the Ginza. Yet another substation is in the base of this building on the right. And then we have Nagoya, the fourth largest city in Japan, where Chubu Electric, the utility there, knew it needed to build a new substation, understood that the city planned to redevelop the parking lot that served the city's major landmark. The beautiful building at the top is Meijo, the castle of Nagoya, dating back to the early 17th century. So as in Edinburgh, the people in Nagoya had quite a set of regulations and challenges to deal with in a park setting with a major, unique, historical, cultural landmark to be respectful of. And they designed it to do that. This low-slung building here is actually the ventilation building for the substation. There's a waterfall on the side that faces the castle, and there's actually even a moat around it. The taller building accommodates the elevator access into the substation. There is actually an elevator in this low-slung building. It actually serves also as the entrance to a public parking garage below. Here's how they did it. You can see it all stacked beneath the surface in Nagoya. You see the transformer rooms at the bottom, about 100 feet underground. And then a layer of cable, a level of a cable room, a layer of the switchgear room, and then the public parking lot, which is accessible through the ventilation building. You can see on the left what you also saw in this building, in this picture on the left, that's a no theater that was built by the city as part of that redevelopment. Similarly, in London, where you see me having just emerged from the substation underneath Leicester Square, the utility in London, which was at the time London Electricity, arranged with the city of Westminster, which was about to undertake a park renovation, to build a needed substation in the heart of London's theatre district. And in fact, the controls to access this facility are built into the TKTS booth. Yes, that's the TKTS booth to get your discount theater tickets for London's West End. And here's the square a few days later as they were decking it out to look like a Greek village for the premiere of Mamma Mia. So you see there thousands of movie fans standing on top of a substation without any idea. Here in New York, we have one glorious example of stacked uses. This is 7 World Trade. I'm only going to show one pic because when Janno Lieber arrives, he'll be showing many. But this is our one case of, so far, of having a substation with a maximum efficiency of land underneath some other facility and absolutely attractive to the neighborhood. Nobody knows it's there unless they've read some press account of it. We can do this too. The first step is to change the use group assignment, sorry to get zoningly technical, for substations in our zoning code to allow them to be built as of right in commercial and residential zones as well as manufacturing zones. And we can talk more about that in Q&A. Believe me, lots of details are in the Neighborly Substation Report, which is in your folder. Thank you.
Our first speaker was going to be Janno Lieber. He's going to arrive shortly, but I'm going to introduce all of them, including him. He'll just have to accept my mistakes or otherwise. This is exactly the right panel to discuss these issues. It's a sequence of property developers, Con Ed, and the people who actually do the electricity, and the environmental interests. They bring to this room today a very broad range of experience in federal, state, municipal government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector, and the volunteer world. Very briefly, and once again, the bios are in your package. shall we do Janno first, even though he's not here? Janno Lieber is president of the World Trade Center Properties. He manages all aspects of the Silverstein organization's efforts to rebuild the World Trade Center. He had a distinguished career before that in the private sector. He practiced law, and he worked in the mayor's office for a stretch. Ron Bozgo has been in the utility industry for 35 years. He's presently Vice President of Engineering and Design at Con Ed, and before that he worked at American Electric Power, one of the biggest electricity companies with myriad interests. Jim Gallagher is a Senior Vice President of Energy Policy at the New York City Economic Development Corporation. It's an office that advises the mayor on these issues. He serves as the chairman of the city's Energy Policy Task Force. Was or is, I forget, the New York with the PSC. He previously was with Northeast Utilities, TVA. These are the people, in case, well, you know these names. I mean, these people power the nation, right? And then we have Ashok Gupta, who's the Air and Energy Program Director and Senior Energy Economist at NRDC. Ashok is, as far as I can tell, on just about every key board that has anything to do with energy and the environment, and it's been, I must say, a tremendous pleasure and honor to get to know him. 30 years ago, I couldn't find anything right about it at the NRDC, and I'm just delighted at how much one of us has matured since then. Okay, who do we? I guess we're going to start. We'll start with Ron.
Advance is hit the enter button. This time? Okay, great. Good morning, and I'd like to thank Peter for his comments and welcoming me, and I'd like to thank the Manhattan Institute for providing a forum where we can discuss this important topic. This is a topic that is near and dear to Con Edison and to me personally. I'm going to start. My presentation is really going to be focused on why we need substations and how we try and integrate them into the community. And first, a little bit about Con Edison. We're a multi-commodity utility. We have electric. We serve electric in all 5 boroughs in Westchester. We also have a steam company. Steam is provided in Manhattan, southern part of Manhattan, south of 96th Street. And gas, we're also a large gas company. We provide gas to North Queens and upward into Westchester. We have a lot of cables above ground, underground. It's something like 130,000 miles of cable. You can wrap the earth 5 times with it. You'll see about 70% of that cable is underground, which gives us another challenge that I'll talk to a little bit later on in my presentation. And the topic of the day is substations, and we have 60 area substations as well as 38 transmission substations. And I'll explain the difference between the two as I get into my presentation. This is a chart that shows the load growth in New York City, right? And it goes back to the 1950s. And you see a fairly sustained growth in electric demand by our customers that go through that whole period. That dip there that you see is around the mid-'70s when the city and the nation was going through some difficult times with the Arab oil embargo, as well as the city's own financial problem and jobs leaving the city. But you see, as once you get past that 3 to 4 year period, you go back to a sustained growth period. I went back and looked at the, where we are today, right? No one really knows what's going to happen given this economic climate, what growth would be like in the immediate future, right? So curiously, I went back and looked at the 30s, right, to see how what happened to electric load growth in New York City. And it was a very similar type of, situation developed. We see that peak there, right? That drop off was a little steeper in the Depression in about 1931-32. It was a shorter period where we had this reduction in load growth, and then it resumed back to growth that you see typically shown here. This is an overview of the electric supply system, right? And this is typical pretty much of all utilities, right? If you look at the left side of that chart there, you'll see the generating stations as well as the transmission systems that interconnect to what we call our transmission substations, which are the orange boxes on that slide there. And what the transmission substations do, they basically channel this power that we import over to different areas in the city. And that power is received by what we call area substations because they are in the particular neighborhoods where the power gets distributed. And what we have in our Con Ed system is we have a variety of networks, and I'll go into that in the next slide. But this sort of schematically shows that each of those area substations feeds a particular neighborhood. When you design these systems, right, what you try and do is you want the load-serving entity to be as close to the load as possible. And the reason for that is that you want to minimize your line losses. So one way of doing that is to keep the voltage of the transport system. What is shown here is the 345 kV and 138 kV systems, the high voltage systems. You want to keep that voltage as high as possible because as you double the voltage, you quadruple the power delivery capability. So you need less of a corridor to transmit power into the city, the higher voltage you keep. And by keeping that voltage high, the benefit of that is that you keep your line losses down, which provides for a very cost-efficient delivery system, as well as there's an environmental benefit to that too. You don't need to burn more fuel to make up for those losses that you would have in a lower voltage system. This is how we look at New York City. You'll see there are 69 networks that are shown here. Each of those little boxes is a network. Our planning and forecasting people look at each of those 69 networks. They try and forecast what customer demands would be, customer behavior, what load growth would be, and what facilities we need to accommodate that. Do we need to add more area substations? Do we need to get more generation? Do we need more transmission facilities? All of that comes in our reviews and load forecast, which is typically a 10-year and sometimes further time horizon. Here's an example of Manhattan, just taking those 69 networks and now looking at the 36 that are in Manhattan. And Manhattan is, if you look at other large urban centers, right, has the highest power density of any of them out there. I mean, it has bigger than Tokyo, London, Chicago. And the challenge that presents is that you got to get a lot of power into really a small piece of geography. And what this shows here is if you look at all these boxes there, you'll see those are the networks that are in Manhattan. And those orange dots there represent the area substations that serve those networks. And what's blown up here is what we call the Grand Central Network, right? And that is fed by the East 40th Street substation. So the transmission facilities, those high voltage lines come into that area station, which feeds what we call the Grand Central Network. And those network is fed from those feeders emanating from the station. I have a slide that shows really the underground network and how some of the difficulties we have in routing cables through the streets of Manhattan and also getting the transmission over to these facilities. But these are feeders emanate from that station and basically feed load and end up actually at the 120 volt outlets that you see in this building and all buildings across Manhattan. This was what the system looked like in 2007, right? And if you look at the Harlem network, which is this network up here, it was served by one substation, right? And Harlem, as we all know, is going through a renaissance. There's been a lot of remarkable and wonderful development that's going on in that area. Our planners, foresaw this and saw that there was a need to do something in the Harlem network. And what we had done there is we ended up splitting the network, right? And you'll see that what we did, what was one piece of geography, we added another substation called the Parkview substation, right? And we had to bring transmission facilities into that. And this involves, when you site a particular substation, right, it involves a lot of work. You got to look at one is the access to transmission. You got to look at what the zoning requirements are for that. You need to look at the geotech, the soil conditions, how you would build foundations, so how you would connect into the distribution network. So there is quite a bit of work that goes on in adding a new area substation. And then with that network divided, you have the various feeders that go out into the streets and pick up the load, the customer load. This is another part of the real estate that we look at as well. Matter of fact, I think, Jim, this is right outside your offices on William Street. This goes back. It's a really, it looks different now, I hope, right? It goes back to after 9/11, where we did a lot of reconstruction in the downtown network. And this shows you how important it is for us, not only the above-surface geography, but the below-surface real estate, and how sometimes the challenges we face in getting transmission cables over to our area substations as well as distribution feeders out there. So, you know, there's quite a bit of work that goes on, and clearly moving, you can see that sometimes the difficulty that you would incur in moving these facilities just a few blocks and what you would encounter below the surface, below street level. This is, to an engineer's eye, you know, these are sort of an older vintage look of substations that we have and sprinkled around the city. You'll notice that we don't put any Con Ed signage on them at all. You don't see any of the transformer, you know, electrical equipment. They're all behind, enclosed behind these walls here. But what we've done since then, and we've changed our design of these stations, and this is what more of our current designs would look like. And you'll see here what Hope was talking about, the 7 World Trade Center. Our substation is in the bottom of that high rise. And the upper left was Mott Haven, which Hope had also mentioned in hers, what that looks like. And then we have what is Astor, which is in the Midtown Manhattan on the west side. And those buildings are sort of gray and red brick colored buildings there. I think you'd be hard-pressed to know that there's a substation behind it. Reminds me, I got a kick out of that cartoon, which, you know, sort of speaks to this as well. So we spent, you know, a lot of time. We try to blend this into the community so that it is not obvious to the community that there is a major electrical facility that's important to them in their area. And you know, you walk by these facilities, and they're really difficult to determine that there is a lot of all those. Matter of fact, the upper left, there's a transmission and an area substation combined in one. What we also do is, and Con Ed was instrumental in setting this up, is setting up an international benchmarking, you know, association. And these are all the prominent utilities around the world. We typically meet twice a year. We also have exchanged engineers with them. We try and learn from them. We try and teach them what we know. It's really a sharing of best practices that we partake in each. And we've learned from them, and we think we've taught them a few things as well, too. And it's been a very good and productive, you know, exercise for us to be involved in this. And we plan to continue with that in that association. Summary, clearly, you know, what we would like to see is greater flexibility in zoning of our transmission and area substations in all of the areas, whether commercial, residential, or manufacturing. We're committed to, when we build our new substations, to blend them into the local neighborhoods. We realize that, you know, if we want to have a place in the neighborhood, that we have to listen to the neighborhood. And we do work with the community boards as well in all of these sightings. We're willing to partner with developers and government, and, you know, the example of that is what we've done at the 7 World Trade Center. And we will continue to look for best practices within our own organization, as well as what goes on in the rest of the world to make sure that we keep New York well lit with the best technology that's out there. And that concludes my presentation. So I'll turn it over to Ashok. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ron. We will have questions shortly, but we're going to go through all the panelists first. Janno, Lieber, World Trade Center Properties.
Good morning. I'm Janno Lieber. I'm the World Trade Center Project Director for Silverstein. And I was asked to speak a little bit about the experience at 7 World Trade Center, where we built a 1.7 million square foot office tower on top of the Con Ed substation. This is, I really don't have all of the expertise necessary to respond to a lot of the core vision laid out by Hope Cohen, but I can tell you a little bit about that project and why I think it might provide a template for some of the issues you are trying to address. One is, I mean, the circumstances, and we're talking about the rebuilding of 7 World Trade Center in the wake of 9/11, but the circumstances of that, where obviously there had been a terrorist attack and the destruction of all of that office space and the terrible loss of life, created a kind of a political dynamic and a consensus that overrode some of the natural resistance to infrastructure construction. Everyone recognized that there needed to be a restoration of the substation Con Ed infrastructure capacity that was destroyed in the loss of 7 World Trade. So that sort of broke, I think, some of the hardened resistance that sometimes Con Ed and others who are trying to address this face. The second variable that was important, and I think speaks to some of what you heard from Hope, is that because the project, 7 World Trade Center, sits on Port Authority land, it is not, that's the old 7, so we'll, but I'll come back to, I'll go through it in a moment, but because 7 World Trade Center sits on Port Authority land, because of the Port Authority's unique legal standing as a bi-state entity created by Congress, which is sort of above state and local jurisdiction and exempt from it in most ways. Because of that, the zoning and a lot of the multi-government resistance and pushback that might normally apply did not in this case. And the third, and this is really what we can speak to most because it goes to the question of whether you can design substations which are do in fact blend into the community and do break the expectation that they're going to be a blight on the streetscape for both commercial reasons and also because of the consensus that we really needed to do something in design that we would all be proud of in rebuilding the World Trade Center. There was a lot of innovative thinking brought to bear about how to make that substation from a streetscape and from a visual standpoint look at its best. So those are, I think, the 3 variables that are unique to this project, and maybe we can draw some lessons from them. So that's the old 7 World Trade Center, built in the mid-'80s by Larry Silverstein, not on, it was adjacent to what we all think of as the World Trade Center site where the Twin Towers stood. It was some land that the Port Authority owned that had not been developed in the context of the original World Trade Center. They put it out to bid competitively. Silverstein was the winner and built a I think 2.1 or 2.2 million square foot office building on that site. If you recall, it was connected to the World Trade Center Plaza by a bridge over VC Street, and in retrospect, a somewhat clumsy situation from a streetscape standpoint because of the the reality of the World Trade Center being sort of an elevated plinth, a plaza, which was in keeping with the planning realities of that time was kind of cut off from the neighborhood, and 7 reflected some of that and had to adjust to some of that. But it was destroyed on 9/11. It was the last building to go down on 9/11, if you recall, about 5 o'clock. There was no loss of life, which I think also was part of the reason it could be rebuilt promptly. So that, in 2002, is what the site looked like. And you'll see it was a site which actually, Greenwich Street kind of dead-ended into the site. If you came down Greenwich Street, you sort of hit the back side of 7 and could go no further in the old days. So what we did from a planning standpoint, which was important to the whole plan for the World Trade Center, is made it rebuild a slimmer building and reintroduced Greenwich Street, a historic New York City street that had been lost in the building of the original World Trade Center, and put a little park there, which has been a great success. Much more, I think, planning and streetscape sensitive. So we began building the building, and obviously this is after the substation is up to that level. You see the concrete enclosure of the substation at the base. And we worked with Con Ed. It was complicated. There were business issues that were never resolved until after the building was completed. And I know Con Ed is, I heard the earlier speaker talk about trying to do this more with developers. One, I think the lessons that we developers and Con Ed need to take up is you need a framework for how developers can interact with Con Ed, because if you have to negotiate your own deal, it can take a very, very long time. So you need a template that you can use again and again that everyone will be able to rely on. But the substation is at the base, and we built it for Con Ed with a single contractor and just kept going. That was a shot at the time of the completion of the base. I think the installation of the transformers around that time, that was, I think, when that photo was taken. The building opened 4 years after it had been, construction had been begun, and obviously that's a source of pride to us, given all the difficulties that the World Trade Center has and sometimes continues to have in keeping momentum going. It opened on time in spring of 2006, and that's the building today. Now, you can see all of that right there is the Con Ed substation and some mechanical floors serving the building at the base. So it presented a unique challenge. You had a tremendous consensus that we need to make downtown and the World Trade Center more lively, more friendly to the community, better from a mixed-use standpoint as downtown is becoming more residential, more retail, a livelier place, and how to deal with the fact that you had a base which had no ability to accommodate retail and was going to have to be a concrete enclosure. So we started thinking about how to make this beautiful and lively and something people would be excited about. And this very intricate stainless steel enclosure that you see around it reconciles both looks, it has lighting in it, and it also breathes for the Con Ed equipment to function as it needs to. So that was done, this is this stuff you see here. That was done by Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, working with a famous glass and steel artist named Jamie Carpenter, who's a MacArthur Foundation award winner. And there was lighting, a sort of a special lighting system placed in it to enliven it at night, which I can't tell you how much difference that makes to people in the neighborhood to have something which functions as, enlivens an area which, especially since the World Trade Center is not fully rebuilt, can be a little quiet at night and makes it fun and certainly active. And you see the light coming out of the entrance. The lobby is the only portion of the ground floor that's not the Con Ed substation. We did not have much room to work with other than the lobby and certainly no ability to accommodate retail. That's the wall with the special lighting in it. The lighting is dynamic. It follows. It does all kinds of kooky stuff I'm not going to be able to fully capture, but it follows you as you walk down the street. It has patterns that are somewhat random and interactive. And we're using a lot of good Con Ed power to create a wall, which is a Jenny Holzer installation. Jenny Holzer, the famous graphic artist, put an installation of American poetry and prose, all things about New York City, and we've made it the art piece at the center of the lobby. And the governor of the state of New York says it's one of the few things he can actually read. He really told us that. So that's the plaza, the park that we created right across the street with the benefit of that different design. And the reason, among others, that the Con Ed substation is so important is not only are we trying to refire downtown as a great commercial business district, but it has become a great residential neighborhood. And this is just a shot that kind of brings that into home with 7 World Trade in the background, but and the Bank of America headquarters operations, the Bank of New York Operations Center right there. But then there's a new condo building with Barnes & Noble and Whole Foods and Bed Bath & Beyond in it, and this public school here, which is, I think, the highest rated public school in the city of New York. So you see the numbers, the residential population downtown has literally doubled since 9/11. It's become a very dynamic and exciting place, very upscale. I was stunned to read in the last few days is, I think, on the numbers, the most prosperous of the census districts that was reviewed in that latest interim census reported this week. And so all over New York, both in Battery Park City, all over downtown, both Battery Park City and the old Wall Street area, you've got people moving in where there used to be offices. And alongside it has been the success of 7 World Trade Center, which has demonstrated that that downtown will be reborn as a great office center, and the roster of tenants, I think, says a lot. I neglected to mention this was the first LEED certified green office building in New York City. That's one of the attractions that we've had for some great international companies, and we want to use less power, but we love that the Con Ed substation is there for all of us. And one highlight for us is in the middle of this economic crisis, a month or two ago, we signed a big lease with a German investment bank called West LB for the top 3 floors of the building, which I think was sort of a man bites dog story, and we got a record-setting rent for it. And it bodes, more important than our commercial success is, it bodes well for downtown as we come through this terrible period. The building's won a lot of awards for design, and we're proud of that. And there's just a plan that shows you how it relates to the rest of the World Trade Center. Hopefully one day, just directly south of it, will be a Frank Gehry Performing Arts Center. But it's, and that is the image of all of what we will and we fully intend to build at the World Trade Center. The 3 towers we're building by Norman Foster, Richard Rogers, and Fumiko Maki, alongside the Freedom Tower, and little old 7 World Trade with its substation at its base back standing there. I mean, incidentally, the success of the substation also gave people confidence that the Freedom Tower, with its armored base, could be a design success, notwithstanding those late-breaking police department requirements. So I think that the Con Ed substation also was important from that standpoint, showing people you could do this with a base that wouldn't kill the streetscape. Okay, so that's hopefully what I can add. I mean, in closing, I would just emphasize that I really did mean it. If we're going to be serious about having developers get involved with substations on some regular basis, there's going to have to be a template alongside the zoning improvements that you talked about, because doing it on the fly like we did, it was successful, but we did with Con Ed, is probably not a model that you want to repeat. So I hope we would work with Con Ed, the real estate community, to work out a template that can be replicated again and again. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Janno. Jim Gallagher, the city's Economic Development Corporation.
I'm not going to be using PowerPoint, so let me close this. Which is okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I want to first of all compliment Hope on an excellent report, and also bringing attention to this topic, which many might find very arcane. Usually, when I told people in the office what I was going to speak about, and they were like, wrinkled their forehead, and what's that all about? And, but I think it's critical to the city, and I want to get into that and explain why. I also want to compliment the Manhattan Institute for hosting this event and providing us all with the opportunity to speak on this topic. As many of you are aware, New York City has many energy challenges. Energy costs, among the highest in the country, if not the highest in the continental U.S. Despite previous energy efficiency reduction efforts, load continues to grow, and Ron showed a chart showing that increasing growth, putting continued stress on our power system. He also mentioned the underground infrastructure in the city. The city of New York is really unique almost in the United States, and how extensive the underground infrastructure is. I crossed out my 90,000 miles of underground conductor, which I always use when Ron mentioned 130,000 miles. So I'll begin working with that number. But I know in my days at the PSC, when I was responsible for the group that oversaw the reliability of the distribution system, I realized how expensive it is to maintain and upgrade that system. Those 90, 130,000 miles, most of it needs to be upgraded around New York City, but the cost of upgrading is very steep. I recall a few years ago, the cost of upgrading just 100 miles, replacing 100 miles of that 130,000 miles, cost a little over $100 million. Con Ed spends over $1 billion a year in terms of maintaining and improving its system, and oftentimes these expenditures are just to keep the system operating, not so much replacing and upgrading as much as the company would like. And lastly, as mentioned in Hope's report, land is very difficult to find, and land is very expensive. It's difficult to find sites for either power plants or substations, and then they're very expensive to build. Typically, construction costs in New York City range from 50% to 200% of the cost of building similar structures in New Jersey or upstate New York. A lot of that having to do with labor costs, but also just the logistics of bringing materials into the city, scheduling trucks, scheduling closing of streets. It's very expensive, very difficult. So with that backdrop and in that context, I would like to make a couple comments with respect to Hope's report, and as well as the overall concept of ensuring that substations that are built to meet customer service needs are also compatible with the community. Before I get into this, I just want to mention one thing that I did some research before coming in here to talk to you about this specific topic, and I was struck by how this isn't just a Western world or modern world issue, the industrialized world. One of the best products I found on the internet was the Zambian government standard, the Guide for Design and Construction Operation Electric Power Substations for Community Acceptance and Environmental Compatibility. And there's a lot of good stuff in here. And I was struck by, I recall Bill Richardson at the time of the 2003 blackout comparing the U.S. power grid to a third world power grid. Well, if that's the case, we're not doing that bad. I have three major points I want to make, and the first one is, and it's touched on and mentioned frequently in Hope's report, and that's the importance of communication. Part one of Hope's report does mention that the city's Plan YC, which is the city's long-term sustainability plan, makes a statement that finding locations to site substations within New York City is a growing challenge, and it doesn't go into too much more detail, and that's pretty accurate. However, that very same section does stress the importance of communication, of not just Con Edison with the public, but also Con Edison with the city. It's important that as we begin to move further into the 21st century and we upgrade the grid, that this improved communication and also transparency about Con Edison's plans for construction, plans for growth are known not just by the city, but also by the residents of the city as we move forward. Times have changed over the past several years, and whether we have rigid zoning or not, if the community opposes a project and opposes a substation, for example, it's very likely that it's not going to get built. So it's more critical than ever, and I believe Con Ed recognizes and other utilities recognize the importance of reaching out and hearing from the public of concerns about not just the siting, but also proper design parameters. And further, the public is paying for the infrastructure through your electric rates, so the public really has a right to be at that table. I would, one thing I would like to do is get the city as well more involved in understanding the long-term plans for construction. I know Con Edison plans on spending several $1 billion over the next several years in upgrading the system and building new substations. And the city really needs to have, we have good relationship with Con Ed, but we need a better relationship in terms of understanding the infrastructure. I've been down in my position here in the city for a year from the Public Service Commission, and one of the first things I did was ask how often the city met with Con Edison to talk about infrastructure development plans and substation development. At the PSC, we met quarterly, went over the list of projects, how they're doing, what's the cost, what's the schedule, any problems. When I first came to the city, it was, well, a few years back, we had a really good conversation with the city, with Con Ed, some really good slides they had about, their future plans, and it needs to be improved. And, I hope to work with Ron and the rest of the company about getting the city as well as the company more engaged in a more transparent process to understand future plans. This will do a couple things. It will, first of all, better align the company's planning with the city's planning. I mean, the city, and I can speak from my experience at Economic Development Corporation, has plans for various projects around the city, whether it's the rail yards in Western Manhattan, whether it's projects in Brooklyn, Hunts Point, Coney Island. We need to work together in order to best plan the system. So we need to align the company's planning with the city's planning and development objectives. And the second part of that is we need to better flag matters that would benefit from public input. If there is going to be a substation needed in a certain area, we need to make sure that the public is brought into the process very early on. Excuse me one second. The second major point I want to make has to do with, first of all, the need for substations and ensuring that substations are only built when they're absolutely needed and that they're sized appropriately. And this will have a benefit not just for Con Edison, but also for the community. There's a need for improved integrated T&D, transmission and distribution planning. And Con Ed is doing this planning. I think the public needs to know more about it, but basically what it involves is not just looking at load growth as a static indicator that you need to respond to with the construction of more substations or power plants, but it's combining, looking at a network, and Ron mentioned the networks, the 57 networks within the city, which networks are really constrained, where might you need load relief in the future, but not just responding to that load relief through building a substation, but also through targeted energy efficiency programs, targeted local distributed generation, district energy projects, and even further what I'll call microgrids. And there's a lot of discussions in Washington right now about upgrading our infrastructure, including the development of microgrids with district energy systems that serve small areas. So it's looking at all these options at the same time compared to one another, and to the extent you can, minimizing the size of substations, deferring the need for substations as long as possible. An important component of this integrated T&D planning process, again, is involving a strong public input and outreach process. And I believe Con Ed is doing effective integrated T&D planning, and I think the word needs to get out to the public, and the public needs to get more involved in that process. The third point I want to make is we need to remember the role of the Public Service Commission, and I don't believe it's mentioned much in Hope's report, but while Con Edison has legal responsibility for maintaining reliability, including making decisions about investments in necessary infrastructure, including substations, it is regulated by the Public Service Commission. The delivery side of the company is regulated, and its operations are overseen by the Public Service Commission. In fact, for transmission-related investments, which include substations, such as the Sherman Creek substation that was referenced in a report, and you also saw photographs in the presentation, the state's public service law does supplant local procedural permitting requirements. So, and specifically, the PSC could refuse to apply any local legal requirements if it finds that such requirements are unreasonably restrictive in terms of not recognizing existing technology, not recognizing the economics of a project, or most importantly, not recognizing the needs of customers, and the needs of customers both in terms of their electric service needs, but also in terms of the environmental and visual impacts of a building, a piece of infrastructure on the public. Also, for local area substations, and these are substations that are not connected to the high voltage grid, such as the Sherman Creek substation, but for the smaller substations that serve local areas, the company is not subject to the need to get a certificate from the PSC to build that plant, but the PSC does have jurisdiction over the company in terms of how it manages its business, all the way down to specific procedures and design approaches for building structures such as the infrastructure. So my major point is that the Public Service Commission should also be brought into these discussions, and there needs to be a partnership of the company, the city, the public, and the Public Service Commission in discussing Con Ed's future infrastructure investment needs, as well as how they impact the community, how they impact the city. I think the final point I want to make is just, first of all, that substations, and this is from experience in speaking to people who live near substations. I mean, substations can be good neighbors. They're quiet, they're safe, but at the same time, don't forget security and safety issues. I do become concerned when I see some substation designs with thoughts of playgrounds on top of the facilities, because every now and then there are problems at substations, and I think we need to be very careful that we keep security in mind and safety of the public in mind as we build them. Also, in terms of them being good neighbors, they're a lot better than having diesel generators in the street as an alternative to meet summer peak loads. And a good example is in the Chelsea neighborhood of New York City. Several years ago, that network was facing growing loads, loads that exceeded the capacity of the local network and the local substation. The substation wasn't built fast enough, so diesel generators on flatbed trucks were brought in to meet the needs. Those diesel generators still in Chelsea in case of problems. But I want to just mention that the community, I'm sure, would much rather have a well-designed substation within our midst rather than something like a diesel generator in a flatbed truck. Lastly, and to conclude, and I won't comment on the specific zoning changes proposed in the report. That's not my specific area of expertise. That's for the city planning department. But I do appreciate the thoughtful suggestions that Hope made, and we do look forward to talking more with you and working through, how we can address this topic and this issue so we can get more flexibility that really helps us meet customer service needs in a most appropriate way. So with that, I'd like to conclude and thank you for the opportunity.
First of all, I love the title of Center for Rethinking Development. I think it's a great idea to rethink and come up with new good ideas, and Hope has done a great job, and congratulations for this excellent report. I think there's broad agreement that we should clearly look at our infrastructure in a new way and try to be smart and try to make it friendly, and we do need the infrastructure. It is critical to meeting our energy needs. We need to be using energy efficiently. We know there's going to be growth in demand, and we want more new growth in electricity demand to meet our transportation needs and other needs. So we need to combine the end-use efficiency with clean supply and integrate it with, first-class infrastructure. And we need to sell the public, policymakers, and others on the need for this infrastructure. And I think that's kind of the challenge we're facing now, not in terms of what we need to do, but can we actually all figure out how to get it done and how to get the policies in place, because this is a public good. It is an infrastructure we need to figure out how to pay for it, how to make it happen. So I think the challenge that faces us is really what Jim was talking about. How do we kind of get the Public Service Commission and the regulators and the regulatory policy and the planning and all that kind of moving forward with some of the thinking that's been already done here. And I think that is going to be very, very important as a next step. I think Con Ed's take is they're certainly open to it. They're, as they say, they're on it. And I think that's a great thing. I think they're a partner that wants to move forward in this direction. I think Janno has demonstrated that it can be done. He asked that we need to kind of not do one-offs and kind of have a template and figure out how this relationship between the developers and Con Ed can be done much more systematically. And I think that's a good next step also in terms of really figuring out how do we do this in an ongoing way. And to me, it's not just about new infrastructure, it's about existing infrastructure and making the existing infrastructure much more compatible with the city's economic development strategy. And it's not only about substation, it's about really all the other infrastructure we're talking about, certainly even new supply, on-site generation. You have buildings like the new Bank of America Tower has a cogen system in it to meet its electricity need. That's a very important project we should look at also in terms of integrating, supply into our development strategies. And there are a lot of other proposals out there in terms of how to bring together more distributed generation. Again, it's not to say we do distributed generation because we don't want to do substations or new infrastructure. We need to do all of these things. We need to figure out how can we really be smart about, again, all of the end-use efficiency, new supply, distributed generation, and infrastructure. So I think the way NRDC sees the way we see it is really the challenge of implementation, getting the regulatory policy piece right, getting beyond the issue of whenever you're dealing with this kind of policy decision is paying for it and how you structure the cost recovery of all of these ideas, and how we look at the issue of public goods and how infrastructure is to be invested in broadly. As a society, we've done not done a very good job of investing in infrastructure, and that's what we're kind of seeing play out in terms of some of the discussions that are going on in Washington in terms of creating funding for infrastructure, because we really have been, our economic growth in the last decade has really been driven more by consumption-driven growth and not investment-driven growth. And we really do need to step up and figure out the right type of policies to encourage more investment in the public goods that we all benefit from. And it's been boiled down to always an issue of how much do we want to pay in taxes, what will our rate impacts be in terms of making these decisions about public goods and infrastructure. And I think if a broader coalition, if Manhattan Institute, NRDC can agree on this idea that we need more and better infrastructure. We need to then move to the next step and ask, how do we pay for it? Why is this an investment that's worth making? And the general trade-off between this, tax rate impact issue and the need for, the next generation set of solutions for our electric needs, from generation to transmission to distribution to end-use efficiencies. I mean, I think that's the challenge we face. I think there's otherwise a willingness on, I think, everybody's part to kind of move in this direction, but we need to kind of struggle through the implementation phase here. So I'm going to stop there. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ashok. We have some time for questions and possible brief comments from the floor. We have a floor mic around, and you can address the panelists or the panel as a whole individually. Sir.
Yeah, I, for years, have been ruminating on the idea of dispersing power generation into smaller units for national security reasons, vulnerability to natural catastrophe, and an independence of power generation. And I had originally thought years ago about taking these nuclear reactors we have on submarines. It's a proven technology, very safe, and implementing that on smaller scale power generators. But now there's recently been a product produced by Hyperion using technology leased from the government, which creates this garden shed size nuclear power generator.
Yeah, but could we get
no moving parts.
We do have to do substations today.
No moving parts, and I'm wondering, in terms of replacing substations with power generators, and whether this has been discussed at all in any of the forums you may have attended.
Well, Ashok did, of course, raise the possibilities of cogen, and perhaps you'd like to develop that a little bit.
I don't really have a lot to add on the specific question, other so I think the issue of how we better integrate our solutions on the generation side with distributed generation energy efficiency, I mean, that's an integrated approach we should be thinking about, is my only general thought, but I don't have any specific knowledge of the technology.
One thing I can add is I mentioned the city's Plan YC, which is the long-term sustainability plan, and that plan specifically called for in any project or development that's greater than 300,000 square feet, which is most large office towers or collections of office towers, that district energy systems need to be analyzed for their feasibility, both in terms of economic feasibility and as well as their environmental impact. We have been working recently with the Planning Commission, looking at various projects that are underway in the city to ensure that those feasibility studies are done. So I think you're going to see a lot more attention to district energy as an option in new large developments that are built in a city.
Yeah. You've got the hand up.
Hi, Howard Husick, Vice President of Manhattan Institute. Thanks to all the panelists for being here. In the backdrop of the conversation was opposition, and I would love to hear from Ron some idea, what are the shibboleths out there? What kind of mutterings do you encounter that have to be overcome through the better communication that Jim talked about? And then if I might, to Janno, a little bit of detail, not too much, about what happened between you and Con Ed that are the kind of issues that will have to be worked out to create the template that you referred to.
There's a couple of things every time we go in front of community boards. There are issues that really relate to not in my backyard type of resistance that we face. People are concerned about, EMF, which we don't believe is an issue, and that I think science has proven that it's not an issue. People are concerned about noise, but we build our facilities to be compliant with the noise codes. People, I think, don't understand, and maybe we don't do a good enough job communicating now, our new design philosophies that try and integrate it better into the community so that it is, not an eyesore to the community. So I think those are challenges that we face, is really just getting the community on board. And probably the other issue that was mentioned here too is really defining the need for these facilities, right? We probably can do a better job in making sure that people understand that it's important to the critical survival of the city and their own economic benefit.
Responding to your request to be brief, the principal issues are cost allocation for capital costs, cost allocation for operational costs, and space allocation issues. If you have a footprint, like we did at 7 World Trade, that is, you're trying to accommodate a building of a certain size, and a building of a certain size has a certain number of elevators, and need for back-of-house space and access to the loading docks, that determines how much space you can share on certain levels. And that architects and engineers and Con Ed and a developer need to be able to resolve that without getting into a protracted negotiation. The other point, it's a more general one, is I think that if we do this, you're going to need some folks both on the development side and the Con Ed side who are accustomed to how the other side looks at the world and what their procedures are and how they get things done. Because developers work in a certain kind of schedule, and they do design a certain way, and they finance in a certain way, and they need to be able to have predictability that process will keep moving. And Con Ed too has their process, which sometimes goes through PSC and other kinds of issues. So you need to reconcile the two processes, have people who are accustomed to working together, and have some standards for those cost and space allocation issues.
Yes.
One of the themes...
Could we have names? I'm sorry, I've been forgetting to tell people. Could we have names and affiliations?
Ted Greenwood, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. One of the themes of what Hope reported from what she learned in Europe and Japan was the emphasis on putting facilities underground. And yet I didn't hear any discussion from any of the other panelists about thoughts of going underground in New York City. Ron talked about compatibility in above-ground structures. Number 7 World Trade Center apparently is an above-ground structure at the base of the building, but any thought about going underground?
You know, we have, each site is different, right? And we don't oppose going underground, right? From an engineering point of view, you can build it almost anywhere, a substation. What gives us difficulty is matter of fact, we did have, you go back into the facility that was built in the mid-50s, we had an underground substation. And we've looked, and it didn't work out well for us, really. Actually, back in the mid-'80s, there was a 12-inch water main that broke, flooded the facility, and created a lot of damage. So it sort of, we're hesitant, I guess, to look at that. There are a lot of considerations when you look at to build an underground facility. It's not only the civil or the structural aspects of it, but there are safety issues that Jim has mentioned for the public at large above it, and as well as people working in those structures. You have to also get a structure that will allow you to have access to your transmission systems and distribution systems. So it's something we don't reject outright, but we do give it careful thought, and it is not, I would say it wouldn't be on our first option of consideration.
I actually do want to add something here, and that is we're focusing on utility uses here, and that's really the focus of the report as well. But there are other substations out there, most notably rail substations and subway substations. And so actually we do have, and I didn't discuss this in the report, but we do have underground substations in New York City. They are New York City Transit substations serving the subway system. Not all of them are underground, but quite a few are. Now, what they do is different, and they have, kind of different loads and different geographical areas of coverage, but those do exist, and actually coincidentally, there's actually a book out on the history of transit substations. It's got some beautiful pictures from the early days of the subway system, and you'll see if you find that book, which you can find at I'll give a little promo for. You can find it at the New York City Transit Museum store. It actually has some photos of the substations that were built in that kind of low-rise, let's match the facade way that we have been talking about in the early days. So there were above-ground ones that were beautifully built, and some of them still exist, and there are some that are also underground.
Ashok?
Yeah, just wanted to not exactly a substation, but we have conversations going on with the city and Con Ed about a proposal for actually a cogeneration facility underground with a park above it as a way to kind of meet the development needs around on the southern part of Riverside South, because there's a lot of development that's being discussed, and we think it would be a much better use of land and overall planning in terms of what's going on in terms of the current Con Ed steam station there and the needs and being more efficient, state-of-the-art technology. Hope's aware of this. It's going through its own process right now in terms of working with the developer and engaging Con Ed on it, and then having to go through the PSC process. So there are discussions, we think quite exciting, around doing something underground that solves multiple problems in terms of, and deals with a lot of these issues that we're talking about. Not a substation, but a cogen facility.
Just the only point I would make, and this builds on something a point Ron made, is I think the critical design issue is keeping water out. And in keeping water out, you're adding to the cost of the substation. And so there are trade-offs. I mean, there are trade-offs between how much customers should be willing to pay for a substation underground that is protected versus one that's above ground but looks good. So there are various things that the public needs to respond to in terms of what their preferences are and what they really ultimately want to pay for.
It's funny that you should mention water, because I was just going to throw out that though we don't have, other than the subway substations that I just mentioned, although we don't have power infrastructure underground or under parks, we do actually have other infrastructure under parks in New York, most notably the stupendous valve chamber for the third water tunnel, which is deep under Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx. And actually they're also now building a water filtration plant under that very park, and there's other stuff elsewhere.
Sir?
John Zeligowski, Earth Tech. I look across the East River quite a bit driving up the drive, the FDR Drive, and I'm wondering if there's any thought of some aesthetic treatment for the Farragut Station, which sits pretty much on the Brooklyn waterfront. Has Con Ed considered that?
Yeah, it goes to all substations that were originally designed as outdoor substations, right? The equipment that is designed for an outdoor substation is different than the equipment that you would put in typically in an enclosed building, right? So once you have that footprint out there as an outdoor station, it's difficult to enclose that. So the answer is there are no plans currently to enclose that.
A question for Mr. Gallagher, that's all right. You mentioned communications and minimization as two of your areas in the presentation. It seems to me that so many of the big developments in New York City have a municipal hand in them. That the new ball stadia, the yards development, Atlantic Yards, West Side Yards. It would seem to me that the city would know what the demand is likely to be in the future, how it will grow, and where the locations for these facilities would need to be.
Right, and that's true for a number of large projects. And my point was that we need to work with Con Ed even earlier, way earlier, while designs are just in the conceptual stage in terms of what the system needs are and what the future load impacts will be on the system. So my point was just that we need to do a better job of working together. We are talking, and my point, my observations are just sometimes it comes a little bit later in the system than I think is optimal.
Yes.
Peter Arnson with Columbus Amsterdam Bid. We have one of the substations that Ron showed in his slides at 109th and Amsterdam. And I know there's been issues with that substation looking at the possibilities of a green roof or green walls. And given this gentleman's question about the other substation on the East River, that might be something that you'd be interested in looking into. But I'm most interested in the environmental issues with putting things on top of substations, be they playgrounds, parks, or housing. If there's any other environmental issues with doing that would preclude that.
I don't think there's any, if you had an existing substation and you wanted to overbuild it, right, I don't think there are significant environmental issues doing that. I think there may be some engineering issues. You know, you need a passageway down, I guess, as Janno mentioned, for elevator shafts, garbage removal, you know, deliveries, and somehow integrating that into an existing site poses some engineering challenge, but it really depends on the property. We've had discussions with developers about overbuilding on our facilities or air rights over our facilities, and we're open to those discussions. So I don't think it's so much an environmental issue as opposed to an engineering issue, and specific sites as well.
Ron mentioned before that one community concern that comes up is fear of health effects from EMF. And there does seem to be absolutely no scientific evidence that it is a health risk. But even if it were, actually covering it up with several feet thick of concrete, as you would have to do when you build a substation, pretty much removes any risk that might be there in the first place, because the building materials actually cut down the transmission.
At the back over there.
We're zoning lawyers, and first of all, to the panel and to Hope, very nice job this morning. Thank you all very much. I have a technical question that I need answered before I get to the policy answer. Going back to the underground substation concept, do these underground substations require a substantial amount of ventilation, primarily, I would imagine, through sidewalk grates and the like? Because if the answer to that is yes, for those of us who deal with community boards and local groups, there's a tremendous pushback regarding the proliferation of sidewalk grates. There are actually ADA and secret issues that need to be addressed in terms of access to the building with people who are challenged in various ways. It's an issue regarding retail entrances to buildings where these grates are going to be placed. And of course, they're the mortal enemy of every $800 pair of women's shoes in New York. So we constantly hear this problem and are asked to reduce the number of grates and the like. Would there be the need to create more grates to handle underground substations?
You have people in those facilities, right? So you need to change the air volume. And they're fairly large volumes of air that need to be exchanged given the size of the equipment. So to answer your question, short answer is yes. Just how you channel that air doesn't necessarily have to be through grates at street level.
The follow-up question is, having been in Europe when this question came up back here in New York, I went out in the streets and I realized that other European cities do not seem to have the extent of the proliferation of grates that American cities tend to. New York's certainly not alone on that. But I was just wondering if there was a different system employed over there that you knew of that reduced the reliance on these sidewalk and street grates for transformer vaults and everything else.
Yeah, I think a lot of the grates in New York, at least that I've never done a study of them, but a lot of them are tied into the city subway system and ventilation, natural ventilation on the subway system, as opposed to cut-head manhole vaults being ventilated. Well, of course, we have them, but I don't think most of the grates you see really involve the subway system, which is more extensive, I think, than most cities would have, most European cities would have.
I'd just like to add here yes, there absolutely has to be some kind of ventilation through grates, but there are many design solutions to that as well. So in Leicester Square, for example, which is a park, there's pretty sizable grates in the sidewalk by the kiosk before you get to the grassy section. In Devonshire Square, another part of London with another substation, they've actually lifted the grates up and planted around them. And then there are side vents. There are a lot of different design solutions. Again, and this report is about two things. It's about opening up the zoning, and along with that, about suggesting a wide variety for different contexts of different design solutions. There's not just one right answer. There are different right answers for different places.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our time. Thank you very much, Hope, and thank you to the panelists.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.